we're seeing average rates of advance around 15 meters per day, and in some cases up to 70 meters per day.
The advances are being measured in meters.
Meters, right.
That sounds like World War I.
It's even slower than World War I. So this is slower than some of the slowest and most casualty accepting campaigns we've seen in any war in the last century.
One of the things I've been struck by as I've looked at the video footage that's come out of this war is that you often see soldiers who are totally unfit for duty. I'm talking about people who are on crutches, people who are missing limbs. You have to ask yourself, why is this happening? What kind of a strategy is that?
I think this is where the Russians believe this is the least worst strategy because they have an advantage in numbers. The problem, of course, is that it leads to historical numbers of casualties. It is unprecedented since World War II.
My understanding is that you found in your research that Russian casualties are much higher than anybody expected.
What we found was that Russian casualties between the beginning of the war, the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and the end of December of 2025 were about 1.2 million casualties, which is roughly 5 times more than in all Russian and Soviet wars combined between the end of World War II and February of 2022. The Russian wars in Chechnya, the Russian wars in Afghanistan, and everything else during the Cold War. It's astonishing numbers.
So you have to ask yourself, how has Russia been able to persist? I mean, some people credit the Afghanistan war as helping bring the Soviet Union to an end. So what are we looking at here?
They're being used as bait. So they draw fire. And when there's artillery that goes off, Russian artillery or Russian drones are able to, say, spot where Ukrainian locations are. Well, I think, the other interesting data point is how slow they're moving on several of the axes, like Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar.
Is there any strategy behind that sort of a tactic?
Well, yeah, I think there is a strategy. I mean, I would say it's not a very good one. It doesn't capture territory relatively quickly. I mean, it is worth noting that the Russians have improved in some areas. Their use of drones at the tactical level has improved. Their use of electronic warfare. They've got some drone units like Rubicon that are actually quite effective at targeting Ukrainian forces on the ground. And the Ukrainians do struggle. The Ukrainians also struggle with numbers of bodies that they can throw at the Russian advances. And Vladimir Putin has found it acceptable to lose 1.2 million plus Russian casualties as long as they're not ones that are the sons and daughters of Moscow or St. Petersburg elite.
So that's what, 35,000 men a month?
A month.
That's a staggering number.
325,000 Russian dead. U.S. lost 70 plus thousand in Vietnam, 2,000 to 3,000 in Afghanistan. I mean, nothing comes close to what the Russians are losing.
It was difficult for me to make sense of how this worked until I started looking at some of the corruption that was taking place.
The corruption within the Russian military has impacted battlefield performance in several ways. One is by sending people who haven't paid bribes onto the battlefield and really into the front lines to try to retake or take territory as dismounted infantry right into the teeth of Ukrainian minefields, drones, and defensive positions. It's essentially a punishment.
So if Russia has had the highest number of casualties since World War II, does that put Ukraine in second place?
Ukraine is not that far behind, but Ukrainian casualties have been in the 500,000 or so realm. By our estimates, there for every 2 to 2.5 Russian casualty, there's been 1 Ukrainian. But the Russians have a much larger population. The Ukrainians aren't a major power They don't have the economy. They don't have the military spending. Russians have traditionally been viewed anyway as a great power.
What are the conclusions for the war of attrition and for Russia's status as a great power that you would draw?
Well, I think it'd be really hard to call the Russians a major power anymore for several reasons. If you're measuring on a performance on the ground, the Russians are about the worst performing major power we've seen since World War II. They're really struggling. In addition, economically and technologically, the Russians are a second or third rate power. We looked at the top 100 technology companies by market capitalization. Not surprisingly, you have a lot of U.S. companies in there. You've got a number of Chinese companies in there, some from Taiwan, a number of European companies. The Russians have 0 top technology companies. The Russians rank near dead last in Stanford University's assessment of AI production in countries. Militarily, economically, technologically, what Vladimir Putin has done over the 4+ years of the war in Ukraine, I mean, it's really tragic what he has done for his country.
So what's the policy implication for the United States there?
I think both economic sanctions and military aid to Ukraine would be extremely helpful and would probably make it very difficult for the Russians to continue to face these kinds of casualties and to face these kinds of costs on their economy. But we just have not seen the U.S. administration willing to take either of those steps.
Shifting topics a little bit, America's disengagement from Ukraine over the last year means that America is learning about modern warfare at a much slower rate than China, which hasn't disengaged from Russia and in fact cooperates with Ukraine on supplying it in many ways as well. And so it seems like China's a lot more engaged with this active conflict that's constantly developing than the United States, which has put the Europeans between itself and its assistance to Ukraine. Do you see any truth to that argument?
The Chinese have recognized that a significant possibility of warfare in the future is protracted. I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear from Ukraine as we go into the 5th year of the war is that you need big munitions stockpiles for months, if not years. And that has been one of the most significant challenges since the war in Ukraine began for the U.S. First, it was 155 millimeter rounds, javelins, Stinger, surface-to-air missiles, U.S. production lines, if they existed, were not producing weapon systems for a protracted war. Chinese are producing weapon systems at an incredible scale, mass and volume in air forces, Navy, ground forces, and obviously space, counter, and then even nuclear weapons. They're attempting to build about 1,000 warheads by 2030, which they're definitely on pace for. I think what we've seen with the U.S. is a recognition of this problem and discussions within the Pentagon about it, but we haven't seen a lot of course corrections yet. I think we are seeing some of those changes in the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
Some of the specific things that we've been looking at is Russian-Chinese cooperation on technology. One of those things which has become increasingly apparent in the course of the Ukrainian war is the need to have marine drones, which have been used by the Ukrainians to great effect against the Black Sea Fleet. We don't even know if these huge naval warships that the United States deploys are even useful in a modern context anymore.
We're not seeing the U.S. Produce the numbers that you need at massive scale for deterrence or warfighting in the Pacific. There are some companies like Anduril that have built systems like Ghost Shark, but not the numbers that you're seeing. I mean, again, you're seeing tens of thousands produced for the Ukrainians. The U.S. is not producing anywhere near those numbers. And what you'd need in the Pacific is longer range, higher payload, and potentially other utilities.
Another thing we've looked at is the main battle tank the United States fields, the Abrams tank, multi-million-dollar weapon. that's susceptible to drones that only cost a few $100s. And the Ukrainians have learned to improve the armor because they've learned from being in the battlefield that these Abrams tanks are susceptible to something as cheap as that. Do you think that the United States is absorbing those lessons at the rate that they need to be since they've started disengaging with Ukraine a year ago?
I don't think the U.S. is learning at the rate that it needs to right now. The lessons from Ukraine, but also the Red Sea operations that the U.S. has been involved in against the Houthis, for example, where it's been using very expensive U.S. weapons systems, naval systems, to shoot down very inexpensive drones. And also, and to transfer some of those lessons into Pacific.
So which country is the premier maritime unmanned vehicle power?
Right now, it's probably the Chinese. You know, what's interesting is the U.S. has potential to do that. It's got some innovative companies.
So not Ukraine, not Russia, the countries which have had the most kinetic experience with sea drones.
Yeah, I think where the Russians and Ukrainians have really made advances in mass and scale, including on the electronic warfare side, is in the air. Drones in the air. Most of the fighting is still happening on land, and that's where most of the Ukrainian drone production, it's the tactical drones that are needed by commanders on the battlefield, or the longer range ones that are used for long range strike into Russia against industrial-based targets, oil and gas refineries in Russia. Sort of long-range drones with higher payloads on them, but not a lot in the maritime domain.
Okay. Seth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.